Hi, this is Mike Callahan. I've been using Ionic for mobile application development since 2014, before it was even officially released. Since then, Ionic has been my go-to technology for building mobile apps. With the release of version 4 in 2019, Ionic grew beyond its humble origins as an Angular-based framework for making mobile apps. Today, Ionic works with a variety of web technologies and has become a first-class citizen for building all manner of web applications. In this course, we're going to focus on React, going from zero code all the way to the app and Play stores. Throughout this course, we're going to cover the important aspects of development with Ionic and React. This lesson will cover the absolute basics, setting up your development environment to be as effective as possible. We'll end with a simple Hello Ionic application. We'll jump right into the application structure, explaining how an Ionic application is laid out. We'll introduce some of the simpler UI components and create a basic side menu for the demo application. The next lesson is all about application storage. Ionic provides a simple storage mechanism that works across web browsers and devices. We'll use this to maintain persistent application data that will survive device restarts. If you don't need specific hardware capabilities other than the ones available through the web browser, you can choose to release your application as a progressive web app, or PWA. While the web is getting more and more capable every day, some functions still require access to the underlying device your app is running on. This lesson will be an introduction to device integration with Capacitor. In the final lesson, we'll bundle the application to be released to the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. I'm going to make some assumptions about some things you should already be familiar with. I expect you to know how to write programs in at least a single programming language. You should understand at least the basics of web page layout with HTML. If you know what a div is or how to create an HTML button, you should be just fine. We will make heavy use of JavaScript and TypeScript, and it will help if you have at least beginner level knowledge. You're also going to want a text editor or integrated development environment. I use and recommend Visual Studio Code. VS Code is a free and open source and cross-platform development environment from Microsoft, designed from the ground up to work with all of the technologies we'll be using. Of course, you're free to use whatever tool you're comfortable with. One more thing I should make clear. This is not a course on React. While I will point out basic aspects of React as they pertain to Ionic, I won't go any deeper than I have to make the demo application work. Up next, we'll install the tools needed for you to complete the demo application. I'm providing instructions for macOS. At this time, I'm running Catalina, but the process should be identical on any recent version of macOS. Windows 10, these instructions should also work if you're on Windows Server or even Windows 7 or 8. And finally, Ubuntu Linux, but you should be able to follow along with any Linux distribution. Don't feel that you need to watch all 3 lessons. Pick the one closest to your system and watch that one. Ionic is supported on a variety of desktop platforms. In this lesson, I'm going to focus on macOS. I'll show you how to install the tools that I use and get the basics up and running as quickly as possible. We'll want to ensure you have all the command line and build tools installed before you write any code. So that's what we'll take care of here. Ionic makes heavy use of Node.js, a JavaScript-based runtime environment. You'll need Git and its related build tools. On a Mac, you probably already have it, but we'll make sure. And of course, you'll also need Ionic. Installing these items is pretty straightforward. You should be able to follow right along. On a Mac, most of the tools you need, if you don't already have them, can be installed through Homebrew. Homebrew bills itself as the Mac's missing package manager. There are a lot of tools and runtime packages available through Homebrew, so I recommend installing it if you don't already have it. You can install it by copying and pasting the commands shown on its homepage into any terminal window. Once we have Homebrew, we can look into installing Git, assuming you don't already have it. So first, let's see if you have it, which you can do with the git -- version command. If it's installed, you'll see a version number, probably 2 point something. If you have a version that says Apple Git, it probably means that you installed it through Xcode's command line tools, and this should be okay. If you don't have Git, or you'd like to upgrade it, you can install it through Homebrew. Simply issue the brew install git command. This will give you the latest appropriate version for your system. When it comes to Node and Node Package Manager, or NPM, my recommendation is to install a tool called the Node Version Manager, or NVM. It's a little more involved, but far more flexible in the long run. NVM is an elegant set of shell script functions to enable the most flexible use of Node you can imagine. Its primary purpose is to enable you to install and switch between multiple versions of Node and NPM instantly. So if you happen to have one project that requires Node 8, but another that requires Node 12, for example, it's easy to keep them both installed, yet still independent from one another. The more important features of Node revolve around root or administrator access or superuser. Once you commit to NVM, there's no reason ever to use sudo. In fact, you don't even need root access to install NVM. This is the recommended method to use on macOS, as it requires no commands not already on a stock Mac system. Once you've installed NVM, you can use it to install any version of Node you want. In this case, we'll install the latest stable version. Simply execute the command shown here to download and install the latest long-term support, or LTS, version of Node. Because I'm using the Z shell on Catalina, I have to put this in quotes, otherwise it thinks it's a file name. There are other NVM commands available to you, allowing you to install and use different versions of Node. The most common ones are shown here, and I describe them in more detail on the course lesson page, just below this video. That's all there is to it. At this point, you should have all these tools installed and available to you. Next up, we'll install Ionic and create our very first application. I hope you're as excited as I am. Ionic is supported on a variety of desktop platforms. In this lesson, I'm going to focus on Windows. I'll show you how to install the tools that I use and get the basics up and running as quickly as possible. We'll want to ensure you have all the command line and build tools installed before you write any code. So that's what we'll take care of here. Ionic makes heavy use of Node.js, a JavaScript-based runtime environment. You'll need Git and its related build tools. And of course, you'll also need Ionic. Installing these items is pretty straightforward. You should be able to follow right along. On Windows, if you don't already have Node, I recommend heading over to nodejs.org. When you get there, click the big green button to download the latest LTS, or long-term support version. For me at this time, that version is 12.16.1, but it may be different from you, which is fine. Once it's downloaded, you should be able to install it, accepting all the defaults. Next up is Git. We won't be doing a lot with Git, at least not right away, but Ionic uses it, so you should have it. Head over to git-scm.com. Look for the download button and click it. Once downloaded, just like with Node, you should be able to accept the defaults. Once you've installed Git and Node, you have a choice to make. During this course, we will occasionally make use of the command line. Git installed a version of the popular Linux bash shell called Git Bash. You can also use the normal Windows command prompt or Windows PowerShell. Use whichever you feel most comfortable with. I promise I'll try not to use any commands that are unique to any one of them. Using your preferred command shell, enter the node command with the -- version switch, and the git command also with the -- version switch. You should see something similar to what I'm showing here. If not, then something went wrong and you'll need to try the installers again. And really that's all there is to it. At this point, you should have all of these tools installed and available. Next up, we'll install Ionic and create our very first application. Ionic is supported on a variety of desktop platforms. In this section, I'm going to focus on Ubuntu Linux, but you should be able to follow along with any modern Linux distribution. I'll show you how to install the tools that I use and get the basics up and running as quickly as possible. We'll want to ensure you have all the command line and build tools installed before you write any code. So that's what we'll take care of here. Ionic makes heavy use of Node.js, a JavaScript-based runtime environment. You'll need Git and its related build tools. And of course, you'll also need Ionic. Installing these items is pretty straightforward. You should be able to follow right along. Linux users tend to be all about choices, so I'm going to provide 3 different options for installing these tools. You can choose to install everything directly from the provider's websites. You can use your distribution's package manager. For Node, there is a third option that I'll discuss, the Node version manager. Most, if not all, these options should work for you, regardless of which Linux distribution you use. Before you decide which method is right for you, let's see whether or not you already have Git installed. It's possible you do. Open a terminal and enter the command node -- version. If you already have it, your system will respond with a version number. If not, as is my case, we'll install it in a moment. Ubuntu helpfully provides the command we need to install it. Let's see what happens when we try that with Git. Enter the command git -- version. Again, I don't have it, but if you do, you'll see a version listed here. And again, Ubuntu helpfully tells me how to go about installing it through the package manager. I'm going to show you the other 2 ways, but right now let's do the package manager method. So all I need to do is enter the command that was provided for me. Because I'm using sudo, I have to use my password. And that's really all there is to it. Let's look at that command for git again. Now that the process is complete, I should be able to do those commands again. And you'll see that I'm at node version 8. That's not where I want to be, so there's a better way to do this. Let's check the Git version. Git version's a little old as well, but it'll do just fine. The node version concerns me though, so let's look at the alternative methods. Linux users can install Node directly from the Node.js site. If you can't or don't want to use your distribution's package manager, head over to nodejs.org. When you get there, click the big green button to download the LTS or long-term support version. For me at this time, that version is 12.16.1, but it may be different for you, which is fine. Once downloaded, you should be able to install it, accepting the defaults. The same information applies to Git. We won't be doing a lot with Git, at least not right away, but Ionic uses it, so you should have it. Head over to git-scm.com, look for the download button and click it. Once downloaded, just like with Node, you should be able to accept the defaults. Let me show you one more option for Node. My recommendation is to install a tool called the Node Version Manager, or NVM. It's a little more involved, but far more flexible in the long run. NVM is an elegant set of shell script functions to enable the most flexible use of Node imaginable. The primary purpose of NVM is to enable you to install and switch between multiple versions of Node and NPM instantly. So if you happen to have one project that requires Node 8, but another that requires Node 12, it's easy to keep them both installed yet still independent from one another. To me, the more important features of NVM revolve around root access. Many NPM package installation instructions you'll find on the web instruct you to use the sudo command to install packages globally, because the default location for those global packages are system-protected directories. Though unlikely, it's possible that you might not have root access on your Linux machine, making those instructions worthless. Once you commit to NVM, there's no reason ever to use sudo. In fact, you don't even need root access to install NVM. Everything gets installed under your own user account. So let's see how that works. This is the recommended method to install NVM on Linux. Simply enter either of these two commands, depending on whether or not your system has curl or wget already installed. I'm going to go ahead and paste the wget command into my terminal. I've already uninstalled the other Node version, so I'm going to let NVM handle everything from here on out. As you can see, it was really quick. There is a warning that tells me that I need to reopen my terminal. That's because it added paths and functions to my bash shell. Let me do that right now. So now I don't have Node because I only installed NVM. But if I want to, now I can install, using NVM, any version of Node that I want. I'm going to install the latest LTS version, which again is 12.16.1. And that's all there is to that. There are other NVM commands available to you, allowing you to install and use different versions of Node. The most common ones are shown here, and I describe them in more detail on the course lesson page, just below this video. And that's all there is to it. At this point, you should have all these tools installed and available. Next up, we'll install Ionic and create our very first application. The final thing we need to do is install the latest version of the Ionic CLI, and we'll do that with npm. Once we've finished, we'll be able to use the CLI to create our very first app. I'm going to run these commands on my Mac, but you should be able to follow along on any operating system that we've discussed so far. One of the things I like to do in my home directory is I have a folder called Git. You can call it anything you want, projects, my projects, Ionic, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to go into my Git folder now, and I'm going to run npm install -g for global at ionic/CLI at latest. Not surprisingly, this will ensure that we get the absolute latest version that there is for us. And it installed version 6.3, and that's going to be important in a moment. Through the rest of this course, I'm going to stick to the command line, but Ionic has a graphic tool, a web-based tool for building Ionic projects rapidly, called the Ionic App Wizard. So I'm going to give that a try right now and see what kind of project it gives us. So here it is at ionicframework.com/start. It's going to ask me for a name. Let's try Hello Ionic. I'm partial to purple, so I'm going to pick purple. I want a side menu template. Looks pretty straightforward, and it defaults us to React. So let's continue. So because I already had an account, I was able to sign in quickly. I edited out that part for you. So now what it does is it gives us a custom install command for the Ionic CLI, and it warns us that we need to have Ionic CLI 6.3 or above, which is why I said it would be important later. So back in my terminal, I've pasted the command that the Ionic App Wizard gave us. So now I'm going to run it and see what it does for us. It wants to know if I want to integrate the app with capacitor. I do, but I don't want to do it yet, so I'm going to take the default of no. And now it's going to run an npm install for me. It shouldn't take too long, but I'll edit out the longest part for us, so you don't have to sit through it. Don't you just love the magic of editing? At this point, it wants to know if I want to create a free Ionic account. I already have an Ionic account, but I'm not going to connect it at this time, so I'm just going to say no. So it's done everything I need. Pretty straightforward. And the next thing it wants me to do is cd into that directory. You can see it already created a Git repository, and we're at the master branch. Well, without further ado, let's fire it up and see what it looks like. We do that with an Ionic serve. And you should be aware that most of the things the Ionic CLI does for us is simply delegating it to the CLI of the technology we're using, in this case React. So you can see there it's doing react-scripts start. And it automatically opened a browser window using my default browser to localhost port 8100. The application it built for us looks kind of like an email box. In fact, that's what it says. It's an inbox. Opening up the Chrome Developer Tools, I can show you a cool thing about the default side menu template from Ionic. It's actually using something called an Ion split view, which gives us a fixed side menu on wider screens. But as the screen gets narrower, like on mobile devices, it collapses to a standard hamburger menu. Pretty cool, don't you think? So that'll do it for this. We just created an app from pretty much nothing. We installed the Ionic CLI, and we used the brand new Ionic App Wizard to get that app built. In the next segment, we're going to take a look at the code behind this and see how it's all put together. Before I open the code, I want to talk about TSX for a moment. React components are written in TSX, at least the Ionic React components. TSX is like JSX, but with TypeScript. Right now, that probably doesn't tell you a whole lot. When you see it, I hope the syntax won't be too jarring. If you've never seen JSX or TSX before, it can take some getting used to. JSX, and by extension TSX, is an extension to JavaScript that enables you to include HTML markup directly inside your code. To show you what I'm talking about, consider this code snippet. We start off with an array of fruits. That should appear pretty normal to anyone familiar with JavaScript. But then look what it does. It immediately returns HTML. So we have a div containing an h1, a paragraph, an h2, and an unordered list. Inside that unordered list, things get a little more interesting. We reference the fruit array and call the array map function. The map function takes an arrow function, which accepts each element as it iterates over the array. Here I'm assigning that array element the letter F. I don't normally recommend naming variables this way, but when I have a single arrow function with a single line of code like I do here, I think it's pretty obvious what's going on. So each element of the fruit array gets mapped to an LI with the fruit of each element of the array. Notice the curly braces, though, surrounding the call to fruit.map. That's an indication to TSX that we're going to run some code here. Think of it essentially as a replacement function. At this point inside the UL, this block is going to get replaced with the execution of what's inside it. And the same thing happens inside of the LI. Rather than display a constant value, we're going to evaluate the value of F and replace that curly brace expression with the value at that point. I promise this will become much more clear as we go. I didn't want you to see the Ionic React code for the first time and not at least have had this brief explanation. So now let's fire up VS Code and have a look at what we're dealing with in the real app the Ionic App Wizard generated for us. Now I want to spend some time reviewing the code that was generated for us. Consider this a guided tour of the Ionic React code that the App Wizard just gave us. Back in my terminal, there's a couple of commands that I'm going to enter now that you might want to make note of. The first one opens Visual Studio Code in the current directory, and I'll do that with code dot being the current directory. And the next one is an option to Ionic serve that does not cause the browser to be opened automatically, and that's the -B switch. So while that's getting set up and running, let's go ahead and look at some of the code that was generated for us. First stop is going to be the Ionic config JSON file. There's not much in here. We have the name of the application, an empty object of integrations, and integrations is like Cordova or capacitor. And you can see the type is React. Next up, let's look at the index.tsx file. This is the programmatic entry point of the application. You can see that we import React DOM. And what React DOM is a high-level library that provides methods for the HTML document object model. And this gets called from the topmost level of the application. The only thing we're doing with it is calling the render function. The render function takes two parameters. It takes an object to be rendered. In this case, it's the app tag, the app component. The second parameter is an element in the page whose ID is root. So here we're just passing a normal JavaScript getElementById function. So now where is that root element defined? That's over here in public in index.html. At the top inside of the head tag, there's a lot of meta tags in there that the Ionic team has spent a lot of time getting right. I don't recommend you ever mess with them. So down here in the body, here's the important piece. Here's the ID root that we were looking for. It's the only thing in the body. So if you think back a moment, we're going to get that div element and replace it with the app component. Now you're probably asking, where's the app component? The app component is in app.tsx. App.tsx is importing a lot of things. We'll skip all the imports and just scroll down to where the component itself is defined. And this is where the application really starts. App is defined as a constant arrow function of the type react.fc. So what is all that about? FC is short for function component. Basically, this is a function that will return some HTML. Let's walk through this file and this function to see what it means. The first thing we see is a call to the useState function. This is a hook. If you've heard about React hooks being all the rage, this is what they are. useState enables you to add state, surprise, surprise, to the otherwise stateless function components. It takes the default state as its parameter. In this case, we're passing an empty string. It returns an array containing two elements. The first element is the object containing our state. In this case, it's the currently selected page defaulting to an empty string. The second element of the array is a function we can use from inside the component to alter the state. When using hooks to manage your state, it is advised never change the state variable directly. So as you look through this code, you won't see any assignments to the selected page variable. Consider it read-only, even though it's technically not. So what's being returned by this function? And for this, I want to overlay the code on top of the browser so we can see what is being rendered with each piece. Well, first we have an Ion app. Ion app is the root Ionic component all applications must use. Inside of that, we have an Ion React router. This is Ionic's thin wrapper around the standard React router. The React router is what lets you create multi-paged applications with rich page transitions in what is really a single-page application. Inside of the Ion React router, we have an Ion split pane. I think in the last video clip, I referred to it as Ion split view. Technical name of the component is Ion split pane. This is the layout that gives you that sidebar menu that collapses automatically. Now inside of the split pane itself, we have that menu. And you can see the menu has an attribute called selected page, and we're setting it to the value of our selected page state variable. As an immediate sibling to the menu component, we have an Ion router outlet. So this is where your page content appears. The menu is off to the left, and the Ion router outlet contains the rest of your application or your content. And just inside of that, we define some routes. Think of a route as a URL. So given a path that starts with /page, followed by another identifier, and the colon means we're going to call that identifier name, whatever is really there. So it could be inbox, page/outbox, trash, etc. We're also passing to route a render function. And a render function simply means, what do we want to happen when this route is matched and tries to render? So that is also an arrow function. It takes a set of properties. Inside of that function, we call setSelectedPage. Remember, we don't want to set the selected page directly by writing to the variable, so we call the state function that was returned to us. So we set selected page to the URL parameter, which was passed in through props, that second part of the route, which is called name. And then what we do is we return a page object, or the page component, passing in whatever properties were given to us using that spread operator. So what that means is whatever properties were passed to our route, we're going to pass through and render that page component with those same properties. And then finally, exact equals true simply means that we only match this route if it's really /page/ some other word. This will make more sense as we start to modify these things. Finally, we have a route called /. So this is the default route. If nothing else is entered, we're simply going to render a redirect to /page/inbox. So what exactly is a page? As you might guess, it's another component. Let's take a look at the page.tsx file. It consists of a function component that returns a bunch of Ionic markup. The primary difference here is that the function component is a generic of type route component props, which is itself a generic. Those are those angle brackets if you're not familiar with that particular style. This is what lets the router pass those route parameters. In this case, it's expecting that route props to contain just a name, which it passes into the arrow function as the value match. Looking down a bit, almost hidden in that jungle of Ionic components is an Explorer container. I'm going to right-click on it and choose Go to Definition. And I'll select this one and double-click. I could have also pressed F12 on my keyboard. The Explorer container is another custom function component which also accepts some container props. This one is much simpler, though, in that it only contains some simple HTML, with only a single variable expansion inside of that strong tag. Finally, let's take a look at the menu. Near the top, the menu defines an app page interface used to hold some common properties about a page, such as its URL, icons, and title. Below that is an array of pages. So now you see where they come from. Next, we have those list of labels that we can see in the menu. And just below that is the markup. The menu itself is built with an ion list, a component designed to format items in, well, you guessed it, a list. The ion note provides what appears to be a header. Then we come to some interesting code. The array map function is called on the app pages array to transform it into a series of ion menu toggle components, which are used to toggle a menu open or closed. Inside of the ion menu toggle is an ion item, which is another ion component which is used to group other components together. In this case, an ion icon and an ion label, both of which should be pretty self-explanatory. The ion item has a router link attribute set to the value of the current page's URL. This tells Ionic's router to switch to that page when clicked. One other thing I want to point out, on the ion item is an attribute called class name. That is set to the value of some code that gets executed. So remember a selected page from app.tsx? Well, this is what we do with it. What this code is saying is if selected page is equal to the page title, then we're going to set class name to the word selected. Otherwise, we're going to set it to an empty string. And that class is what's responsible for highlighting the menu items. Below the menu is another list, generated the same way as the menu. The difference is it uses the labels array and contains no router links. Now, before we wrap up completely, I want to do a couple of fun things, which we'll do in the next video. Now, before we leave this Hello Ionic app, let's do a couple of fun things. How do you think you might customize that page list? If you said modify the app pages array, give yourself a pat on the back. I noticed that there is no sent mail page, so let's create one real quick and see what happens. Let's put it right between Outbox and Favorites. So let's select the Outbox object, copy, and paste a new version right afterwards. Now change the second instance of the word Outbox to Sent Items, and change the URL to /page/sent. Let's leave the two icons alone. Microsoft Outlook uses that paper airplane icon for sent items, so instead, let's go ahead and save the file right now. Here's where it gets fun. As soon as you've saved these changes, the application will be rebuilt automatically and the browser will reload to reflect those changes. But now we have a problem. We've got two pages with the same icon. Let's go ahead and change the icon for the Outbox to Albums Outline for iOS and Albums Sharp for MD. Now, if you're using Visual Studio Code, what you'll see is that it automatically recognizes those identifiers and offers to import them for you, and that's part of the strongly typed code hinting that you get from Ionic React. And again, as we save the page, the icon changes appropriately. What do you think will happen if you now click the new Sent menu? We didn't create a new page or a new route, so will we get a 404? Nope. The page component will render with its name set to the name portion of the route, which is sent. This is because the page component itself is a pretty generic object. Not every page will be that clean and allow you to reuse it like that, but we will make use of this pattern in later chapters of the course. If you want to see where those icons came from, visit ionicons.com. For more information on the components, you can click the Components link right in the middle of the Hello Ionic app itself. And that's a wrap for this lesson and this chapter. You should have a completely installed Ionic development environment, know how to create a new Ionic React app, and even do some minor customizations. So go forth. Rejoice in your newfound power. Play around a bit between now and the next lesson. I hope to see you there soon.